بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
السلام عليك يا أبا عبد الله وعلى الأرواح التي حلت بفنائك. السلام على الحسين وعلى علي بن الحسين وعلى أولاد الحسين وعلى أصحاب الحسين. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. رب اجعلني مقيم الصلاة ومن ذريتي، ربنا وتقبل دعاء. ربنا اغفر لي ولوالدي وللمؤمنين يوم يقوم الحساب. صدق الله العلي العظيم. Elders, brothers, sisters, friends, Assalamu alaikum jami'an wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. In this series of discussions, we've focused on decision making and how to avoid its pitfalls. We started by talking about those decisions that affect us individually, on an individual level, in our relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, for example, in how we interact, how we make decisions in life, which have an impact on us personally. And then, as promised, to kind of widen the circle a little bit, moved on from that to small units, the building blocks of society, being the family unit. And I spoke about marriage yesterday, but marriage from a personal perspective, from a choice perspective, how we approach it for us. And today, I want to continue kind of addressing, in the first part, marriage from its impact on society and community, the family unit essentially, with a focus on this small unit, small building block of society. So, speaking of the family unit, the role of these parents, these husband and wife, on the identity of children, on the personal identity, and this is part 2 today. Then we talk about community identity, and that'll be part 3. And then part 4, how every single one of us and why every single one of us should take responsibility for outcomes in the community. So we're going from kind of the personal to the small unit to the family, essentially husband, wife, and a child, and then beyond that to the community, inshallah. And so just to kind of, from a point of view from marriage, when we choose our partners, and we discussed those biases, those faults, those flaws in our decision making, which are systematic, which make us make wrong decisions, wrong choices, that makes our life difficult for ourselves. Essentially, we make things very hard for ourselves. And so when it comes to thinking of a person, a partner, whose role isn't just to make me a better person, to connect with me, and for me to make them a better person, that's kind of a one-to-one relationship, but also to help me, that's between me and my wife, me and my husband, if you're a lady, to create a family. So how does that choice of the other person, from the point of view of starting a family, creating a family? And here I want to raise a point I think is quite important. Often when we think of getting married, we think of the first part, us. But we don't think of the second part. Because that's the part that's more visible, that's more immediate, that's more clear to us. And so we focus on choosing somebody for us, rather than focusing or even considering what does that mean if this person becomes a parent? Does that make my life easier or harder? Does that contribute to society positively or negatively? And sometimes it's as if we pretend that I can choose somebody who's right for me, and then when I'm ready to start a family, they will somehow convert. They'll somehow become automatically. Or that somehow I can have a relationship with somebody on a level that's kind of for me personally, and then when I'm ready to start a family, I can kind of make a separate decision, an alternative decision, a longer term decision. And there is a flaw here that we often underappreciate. There's something called escalation of commitment. It's one of the biases that we should be aware of. When we make a decision as human beings, when it's a big, salient, clear decision, we think about it seriously. This is a big deal. So we think rationally about it. Essentially, we send it to our system to think about, to process, because it's important. If it's a small thing, we say, that's a small thing. Let's just make a quick, easy decision. So it's like if you're purchasing a house or a car, you probably do some research, you think about it. If you're purchasing, I don't know, food or purchasing something small or a coffee, it doesn't really matter. I'll just see what I feel, how I feel in that very moment. Sounds reasonable, sounds fair enough, right? There's a problem though, is that once we commit to something, we tend to commit in bits. So add our commitment, add commitment, add commitment until we end up in the big decision. And researchers know this very well. Let me tell you an example. It's a funny example actually, but it shows how humans behave. These researchers wanted to see how far they can push people into doing something obviously ridiculous. So what they said, they came up with these huge, they split the group into two randomly, came up with these huge billboards that look really ugly. Knocked on doors and said, can we put this on the front of your house? It's something that will occupy literally half of the front of your house, like take a huge space in your front yard. It's ugly. And so near 90, I think it was 99%, said no. I mean, why would I do that? They said it's a nice message, it's about the environment, or it's about children, or community, or safety. They said, no way. I'm not putting this thing in my house. In the other group, what they did, they knocked on the door and said, we are doing this really nice project to help the community. Would you mind putting this little piece of paper in your window? Like inside the house, in the window, it's barely visible. It's just to show that you're committed. So if somebody pays attention, they see this household is committed. I said, okay, sure. But they came in a while later and said, can we put this slightly bigger piece? Because, you know, the message is kind of happening, it's all good, and we really want to emphasize the message. I said, okay. And then you know what's happening next, right? A significant percentage of them actually agreed to put the huge billboards on the front of their houses, because every time the decision wasn't a big decision. It was like, I've already done something. It's like I'm committed to the project. If I say no, it's like all my previous decisions were wrong. That kind of makes me feel bad. I want to justify the past, so I'm just going to keep doing the same thing in the future so that the past somehow is proven to be correct. We all do this. Companies know this, which is why in many companies, many businesses, they have something called the loss leader. A loss leader is simply a product. It's a product that they lose money on. The purpose of the loss leader is not that you buy it for them to make money. The purpose is that you come in and buy something. On your way out, you'll buy other things. And then once you get used to it, you'll keep coming back and buy other things. That's the point of the loss leader. How is this relevant? Because when we make that decision about this partner of us, husband, wife, who has flaws, who doesn't fit our image of a wife or a husband who will make a good family, we say, well, I'm just going to make a small decision now. Let me satisfy my immediate need. Let me have some fun, let me do something that will work in the short term, and in the long term, I'll make the right decision. But guess what? You're committed. And then next time, it's one step up, and then one step up, and one step up. And there are so many examples, I'm sure you know some, where people ended up marrying somebody they had known consciously they don't want to marry, simply because of this. Some of it is emotional, and some of it is social pressures, and some of it, if a child is in the process of being born, then things get very complicated. And so when we think about, it's easy to just say it's a small decision, but it's not. It's not. That's the point. If you're aware a decision like that is not a small decision, then you will give it the right thought. And so what explains a lot of the behavior, if you think about it, if you think of marriage, that's another issue with it. We think of marriage as a legal, legitimate way to have a physical relationship. That's what marriage is. That's the definition of marriage. It's not about family building. It's not about community. It's not about anything else. And so, of course, if you're thinking of short-term pleasure, if you're thinking of this life, like pleasure today, not pleasure tomorrow, not the day of judgment, and if you're thinking of this being a legal framework for a physical relationship, then of course you're going to choose on the basis of that. You're going to choose somebody attractive to you and ignore everything else. And then you're committed, and then the problem becomes far greater in the long run. And I told you the example, I'm not going to repeat it, but you remember this chocolate or orange example when researchers took people and said, you have to choose now or in the future, now or in a month, whether it's kind of short-term pleasure versus long-term, and they said, in a month, what would you like to have, a chocolate or an orange? The majority said, I want an orange, I want to be healthy, I want something good for me. I said, how about today? They said, give me a chocolate. And we do the same with marriage. We know who we want to be with long-term, but when we choose short-term, we choose different. The other issue that happens as a result with this, when we're thinking about partners, this all or nothing, we somehow start in a sort of relationship, find ourselves liking somebody somehow, and it becomes like them or nothing in the world. And then we find problems and issues, and we start to fix them. Escalation of commitment. And then we start to fix them, and then almost the whole world is now centered on making this single event happen. It's either this person, yes, I know this person is not very religious, but it's okay, they'll change. I know she doesn't wear a hijab, but it's okay, that can change. And so on and so forth. And then we end up, a few years down the line, dealing with the consequences when we have to kind of talk to our daughter and say, well, you have to wear hijab, these are the requirements of Islam. It becomes a bit of a difficult conversation. And so the point isn't just about making the right decision. Often the other extreme of us want to get the perfect person on every level to build a family with. But the point is you make a good choice and you work on it. You make it work. Nothing is you are two individuals building this family unit, and there are differences. So the point, it's about finding this shared vision for a future. Of course attraction is important. It should definitely feature into the equation. The point is, it's not the only thing. It's not the only thing. And so it's not supposed to work perfectly first time, first day. It's supposed to be a kind of a growing together process, an improvement process. And this applies to all of us who are married, that they need to continue to work on it. Need to make each other feel unique and useful and important, and that they're adding value. Remember, I said Islam, it's not about individual, it's about a unit where each person has a unique contribution. So you're irreplaceable. The idea is that you're irreplaceable. You have a role that you cannot be replaced because the other person would feel something missing. If everybody does exactly the same things, then you are replaceable because they can just do what you normally do. And so when it comes to deciding on a partner, we need to bear this in mind, that this will have an impact in the long run. That's part one. Part two is the personal identity question. This is something we often ignore, and ignore because to each and every one of us, almost to each and every one of us, it's not very obvious. What I mean by personal identity is this inner part of us. Like if you dig so deep into each one of us, you will find a set of values, a ruler against which we measure things. You would assume, we all assume that all humans have the same inner compass, this inner, if you think of us, the labeled analogy like an onion, and you peel until you get to the core, that core, there is something there. And that's our inner compass. That's something through which we perceive the world in so many different ways. It's actually scary how significant that part is. And it's just not visible to us. We don't realize it. And so we think everybody is the same as us, and then we get surprised why we have so many different viewpoints on the world. Why two different people or two different families make decisions so differently. And this is formed early in life, usually, and takes many, many years to develop. Why is it of interest to decision making? I'll tell you why. Because remember how most of our decisions are made in system 2, intuitive, especially when we're under pressure, we switch to this intuitive sense. That intuitive sense is not shared by all humans. System 2, the rational part, the logical part, all of us share it. But the other part, which is trained slowly by society, isn't the same. It depends on the environment, the family, that nucleus, that melting pot, that pressure cooker within which we grow up. And then we reach a point where you start to see some very quirky and interesting differences. Like different people, different cultures, different communities face the same question so differently, and so consistently as well. Let me give an example. Isn't it interesting that when you look at the world, you find there are characteristics. You would think humans are the same, right? Humans are the same. Nowadays, the world is so mixed. Ingredients are available to all of us. We can buy the same things and make the same foods. But why do we have differences? If we had differences randomly, that's fine. But we have consistent differences. You can tell just by looking at a plate of food, this is Lebanese, this is Iranian, this is Indian, this is English, this is American, this is Italian. Why? Why is it that Italian children like Italian food, usually, and Indian children like Indian food, typically, and Iraqi children like Iraqi food, typically? And this is the point I'm trying to stress here. It's your measure. So when an Iraqi person eats Indian food, they call it hot. They don't say this is normal. They say it's hot, it's spicy. When an Indian person eats Iraqi food, they say this is bland. Right? They don't say this is spicy as well. They don't call it, Indians don't call their food spicy. They call it normal. Right? Because the sense of normal is defined by society. What is really interesting, and we have a unique opportunity, sisters and brothers, to see this. We who have moved, or who have lived, who are transitional, those who have two cultures in them, you could see how the parents differ from their children. How the parents can't tolerate a certain type of food or find it too hot, but their children can easily eat it. Do you see that? Why is it that you would think this is something innate, it's genetic, it's who we are, but no, it's not who we are actually. It's a lot to do with the environment within which we are raised. And there are so many examples like this, how we define things. I mean, it's so core to us. Let me give you another example. Definition of beauty. Have you noticed how Eastern cultures in general want to be fairer, and Western cultures want to get a tan? Right? It's a bit odd. Have you noticed how descendants of Eastern children who are raised in the West also want to get a tan? So it's not just a function of skin tone, it's actually a function of society. And you see this interesting thing where, let's say, I don't know, a Middle Eastern or an Indian or who lives in a Western environment, all their friends say, nice, you have a tan. And they feel happy. They go home and their parents say, seriously? Do you see the difference? Why? You would think it's a central sense of beauty, but it's not. It's not. It's to do with environment. And if environment imprints these values so fundamental to us, who we find attractive, what food we like to eat, if society impacts these fundamental values in us, what other things that are not so visible to us have also been impacted? Let me give you an interesting study. One study looked in the US, looked at primary school kids. Okay? This is fascinating. Primary school kids, all of them in the US, born in the US, and they belong to either it was Chinese and Indian descent, so Eastern collectivist, societies, collectivist societies that prefer to exist in groups, that give more preference to the group preference than the individual. It's more about group than individual. It's more about collective than individual rights. And Western societies are much more individual, right? And so they brought these kids who are all in America and then gave them a little program, a little app, a device to learn maths. Has nothing to do with culture. And what they did, the difference is so small. What they did, they split them in each group and they said, either you choose the colors of the app yourself, or somebody you trust, such as your teacher or your parents, decide on the color of the app. Essentially, one is completely determined by you individualistically, and one has an input from a person you trust in your inner circle, collectivist. And they monitored progress in learning maths. After a while, they found that descendants from collectivist societies from Chinese and Indian origin did better if somebody else designed the app for them. And descendants of Caucasian kids, descendants of Caucasians who are individualistic, did better when they designed the app for themselves. You see the impact of this identity. See how deep-rooted it is. It even affects how you learn maths when it has nothing to do with it. Because it's just so deep down, so innate, so important. And the problem with it is it's through, these are the pair of glasses through which we see the world. So two people looking at the same thing, one says it's dark, one says it's light, one says it's big, one says it's small. It's the same item. It's the lens through which you look. And so is it surprising then, years later, that you find what is important to parents is not what is so important to their children if there's a transition? And our job as people in charge, maybe I should say something else before I move on to this point. Our children have no say in this, right? You do not choose your identity. It's imposed on you by your parents. You have no say. By the time you have a say, it's too late. Identity has been formed. You already see beauty in a certain way. You already perceive food in a certain way. You already perceive life in a certain way. And so it's completely beyond your control. Whatever you have, you're stuck with. That came from a previous generation's decision. And so when you're choosing a partner, or when you're building it, when we understand that I am building a piece of this community, what piece do I want to put in this community? What identity do I want to imprint in my children? And that identity is formed largely by family, parents. Remember those kids who went to school? It's the same school, same education system, but parents differed. And also by early years in life, so school and community and society. And so of course, if you're answering the same question but comparing it to different, if you have two rulers with different scales on them, and you give the same item to people, they will give you two different numbers, and they're both correct. They both think that they're correct. Essentially, what ruler do you want to give? You see how big this decision is? And the impact of society is really interesting. One point I want to mention, is Islam individualistic or collectivist? Does it say individual rights are more important, or does it say group rights are more important? Does it say, like the capitalist Western world, where it's much more important about you? If you disagree with me, that's your problem, you should respect my rights. I should behave the way I want? Or is it like Eastern cultures? Think of communism as an example, where your rights, individual rights, mean nothing. It's really about the greater good for the greater number, essentially. Islam puts a balance between the two. Islam says, وَلَا تَزِرُ وَازِرَةٌ وِزْرَ أُخْرَى وَإِن تُدْعَ مُثْقَلَةٌ إِلَى حِمْلِهَا لَا يُحْمَلْ مِنْهُ شَيْءٌ. It says, a burdened soul does not carry the burdens of another soul. You're responsible for your own deeds, basically. You're accountable individually for your actions, on one part. So we are individually respected and accountable. And on another, يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا قُوا أَنفُسَكُمْ وَأَهْلِيكُمْ نَارًا وَقُودُهَا النَّاسُ وَالْحِجَارَةُ. Protect yourselves and your family. Yourselves and your family. And the verses I started with tell us the story of Prophet Ibrahim late in his life, after he's achieved and succeeded and delivered. He prays to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and it sums this thing up. He says, رَبِّ جَعَلْنِي مُقِيمَ الصَّلَاةِ وَمِن ذُرِّيَّتِي. Make me, essentially, salah, prayer in Islam is the fundamental of many things. It's not just this act. It's a system symbolized by this thing. This thing, you cannot pray unless you do many other things right before you can pray correctly. So this is a fundamental core part of Islam. And Ibrahim says, رَبِّ جَعَلْنِي مُقِيمَ الصَّلَاةِ. So I would be one of those people that perform this prayer in its best form, in its completion, that I actually deliver it, that do it. Muqim is stronger than somebody who just performs. It's an implementer. وَمِن ذُرِّيَّتِي, and from my offspring. رَبَّنَا وَتَقَبَّلْ دُعَاء. So he's moved from him individually, that he's responsible to deliver this to his children. Then he says, رَبَّنَا اغْفِرْ لِي وَلِوَالِدَيَّ وَلِلْمُؤْمِنِينَ. So he moved from him to his immediate responsibility, his children, to his parents who made him who he is to some extent, and to the community of believers. So you see this transition of responsibility. There's no dividing line, clear dividing line between individual and community. It's both. It's neither extreme towards the individual, nor extreme towards the community. So this is on a personal level. If we want to input that core identity, what are the factors, what are the drivers, what makes this identity the way it is? What makes us fulfill our rights towards our children, essentially, when we do that? And one key aspect is society. One key driver of identity, one of the key determining inputs of identity is society. Let me give you an example of how we are so influenced by the environment around us to ways that are both funny and worrying and scary. One study, they put people in a room. They told them they're doing a survey of something. That's not the point. By the way, you probably get this now in psychology. That's usually not the point. Usually you're doing something, but you're being measured on something else. So they put them in these rooms and said, can you please complete this questionnaire? So they sat there and they're kind of doing that questionnaire. And they put two people they either left them on their own or they put two people who are accomplices. Essentially people who are in on the experiment, but you don't know. They're just sitting like you, they're writing. Then they fuse some smoke into the room. They're sitting in this room and the room starts to fill with smoke. Right? So when people went there on their own, they immediately left. They took about 2 minutes to leave. So like, this is, obviously there is something wrong here, there's smoke in this room, there's probably a fire, I better run. Interestingly though, when there were others in the room, the person who was being kind of tested started to look around, see what these guys do. These guys have been told, they just sat and continued. Looked at the smoke, nothing, just looks like fire, continued. And these people just sat there for almost, I think the percentages were 15% versus 75% who stayed. 15 versus 75%. So essentially on your own, most people left. 85% left, 15 stayed. But when others stayed, you watch them and you just say, okay, they've stayed. Rather than say, well, I disagree with them, that doesn't make much sense. No, you stay. And this was repeated. And so, if this is how we behave when we watch, actually, another even funnier example, I'm not going to tell you much detail, but go on YouTube. You find videos of people going into lifts, elevators as you call them, right? Somebody's going to an elevator, and then a group of people go in, and then when you go there, people just avoid looking at each other, look at something, right? And then they all go randomly, and they assemble themselves into a direction, so they're suddenly all looking at the door. And then this person's thinking, I don't want to be the only one who's not looking at the door, so they just turn very slowly to look at the door. Then all of them turn to look at the side. Like, literally strange. And this person is there thinking, okay, and gradually they position themselves, they pretend to scratch, do something, and turn to look to the side. Then they turn to the back, and so on. They just keep them spinning in the lift, and people just accept it. As in we find it so uncomfortable to go against the crowd, is the point. Watch the videos, they're funnier than me telling them. And so if we live in an environment where people perceive right and wrong in a certain way, well, we would do the same, wouldn't we? Like, seriously, why should we? Is it rational for us to assume that we are immune? Is it rational for us to assume that our children will be okay somehow? Unless we create the right environment for them when we know the environment has so much impact? Let me tell you something more worrying, another study, another funny story. This is a famous study where people were shown a line, like on a card, there's the length of the line. And they were given 3 lines, with obviously, one is really shorter, one is really much longer, and one is right, like obvious. Did them individually. They got about, I think the correct answers were in 100 or 99% of cases, in 2 versions of the study. It's obvious, basically. It's obvious to an average human being, this line is, let's say lines 1, 2, 3. 2 is the right length, 1 is short, 2 is long. They changed the condition. They put them in a room. They put the person in positions, about 20 people in a room. They put them in position 17, 18, 16. So the researcher comes in, gave them these cards, said, well, match the line to this list. So you have 1 line and you have 3 options to choose. And I'll start with this person. Essentially, they're all accomplices up until person 17. They're all part of the experiment until this poor person who doesn't know. And the first person said, let's say the right answer is 2. They said 2, 2, 2, 2, 2. So the person said 2. Right, it's all fine. Then they started to say the wrong answer intentionally. So the first person says 1 when the answer is 2. And this person, the camera is on this person, and they look like, obviously it's wrong. Then the next one. Then the next one. They're all 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1. When it comes to them, they say 1. Repeatedly. What is more worrying is there are a few candidates who said the right answer initially. Like initially they started by saying no. Everybody says 1, they say 2. You would think that's good, right? They did it. They did it again. They did it again. On the 4th or 5th time, they gave up. You would think the hardest one is the first time you go against the crowd, right? But at some point, it takes so much energy to go against the crowd that they just gave up. And again, if you find the videos on YouTube, have a look at them. You see their faces. They're kind of shaking their heads. They're struggling, think like, how is this the right answer? They know what they're doing is wrong. They actually know on their faces, you could tell. They just do it anyway. And so, is it surprising if you're in an environment where everybody in the crowd, in school or at work or somewhere, they go and do something? Is it surprising that at some point, if not the first time, the second, the third, the fourth, you just give up? It's hard work. It takes a lot of energy. So what's the solution? Solution is to create an environment where you don't have to do that. That's the solution. Solution is to create an environment so that when you are facing these difficult situations, the people are actually doing the right thing. In fact, it can be even better. If you mix with the right crowd and you happen to have the wrong answer, when people say the right answer repeatedly, you will also cave in and say the right answer. So there is a point in associating ourselves with the right crowd. There's a point in being there to learn, to benefit, and to create our piece. So my children are a small piece of the community. If I do this, and you do this, everybody else does this, then we have a generation that has a shared identity, that come to this, form this group, and starts to create an environment that's positively reinforcing. That would help all of us succeed, achieve, protect ourselves and our families. That's what it's about. And so when you look at how communities are formed, what are the key ingredients? Let's look at what the Prophet ﷺ did when he came to Medina. And you'll see researchers nowadays say there are 3 key factors in creating an identity, a shared identity. Whether it's a company, whether it's a country, it's anything. You need to put a bunch of ingredients that would create a shared identity. One of them is a set of laws. You know how companies say this is our set of values and they reinforce them? Something you compare against, something that defines rights and responsibilities. Second thing, to kind of create a society, a shared environment where people interact, they have a relationship with each other, teams essentially. So a shared set of rules, teams, and artifacts. You know how companies have a little symbol of the company, a logo, a location, a building? Think of Google, think of Facebook, think of Apple, think of big companies. They always have something, artifacts, features that people feel they're part of the system. What did the Prophet do in Medina? 3 actions. He spent 13 years in Mecca laying the ground, working, then he went to Medina. He took his 3 first actions in Medina. 1, built the mosque, a central meeting place that would facilitate community building, and also it acted in the later years as an artifact, this piece that we're all so proud of, the Masjid al-Nabawi, this mosque. It's a symbol of Islam. He built that. He wrote the constitution of Medina, the set of rules that govern the relationships, Wathiqat al-Medina, Sahifat al-Medina, and he created Brotherhood al-Mu'akha, where he brought people together and said, you are now one team. We're all one team, but within the team there are close people. You are brothers, essentially. You are sharing your food, sharing those supporters of the Prophet, Al-Ansar, who were in Medina, they had money, they had houses, they were in the natural habitat. Those who came from Mecca had to leave everything and go. And so he created this shared environment. And the key exception, as you all know, is that when he had to choose a brother for himself, he chose another muhajir. He didn't choose somebody from Medina, he actually chose somebody who traveled with him as well. Chose Imam Ali alayhi salam. And so, if we want to create this environment where we could support ourselves first and foremost, and then our future generation, because this is easing the burden on us, my sisters, my brothers. When we choose the right person, and then we need external support, instead of fighting with the trend, we can actually be with the trend, with the current. It actually makes life easier for us. And so what this means, it means we need to invest in our communities. This is what it means. what we suffer from often is this culture of consumerism. Essentially, we want to consume, we want to take, we want to use things without really contributing, which is so prevalent, especially on the kind of community work, Islamic work. You usually find a few people who are doing 95% of the work, and the huge majority doing a very small percentage. Partly because we don't have this sense of responsibility, I guess. Partly because we see ourselves, we don't see these other people. We say, well, I'm busy. I am busy, honestly. I have work, I have social commitments, I have many things to do, I can't. I just want there to be a program on Thursday night so I can turn up. And I also want a Muharram program because that's really important to me. And I want my kids to go to a school that's good, and I want them to do kind of Saturday school or after school programs. And I want them to have good friends in the community because, and now I'm convinced I want to create that environment that would instill the right values in them. So I want that. Okay. And I want somebody else to do it for me because I'm busy. And who's not busy? Is anyone here not busy? But unless we move from worrying about ourselves, you see, this is a group project. This is something that suffers a lot from the free rider problem, if you want to look it up. People, free rider problem, people, if you have a bicycle with multiple people, well, it's not a bicycle, but yeah. If you have, say, multiple wheels or multiple people, usually the person in the back doesn't pedal. Have you heard that? Look it up. The person at the back, because there's nobody seeing them whether they're pedaling or not. So they don't pedal. So the person in the front works, everybody works hard apart from the one in the back. That's called a free rider problem. We have a free rider problem in our communities. Because everybody feels they're not being watched. Well, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is watching. But we focus on our immediate needs, our short-term thinking, and say, well, somebody else will probably do it, or somebody should do it. But and so we have this, we behave like customers. Like when we go to a shop, we want an item that we like, we pick it up. We don't worry about how this company, who made it, how much research was invested in it, how much time was invested in cost and energy and teams to transport it, to package it, to put it on the shelf. All of that we don't care about because we're paying money for it, right? So we're paying for all those added values throughout the whole value chain. And then when we take the product and we don't like it, we go and send it back. Just say, well, that's not what I wanted, I want my refund. The thing about the community is it has to be done by somebody. And because it's not one of those things that you're paying for, essentially, the contribution that the community centers add simply by creating an environment where we could sit and talk and create for ourselves this shield, this environment where behavior is more positive than negative, where people do the right things more often than not. If we do that, well, this community center already adds value simply by creating this environment, and also by organizing programs, also by doing many things, answering questions, helping us when we need. And it facilitates the interaction for us to find the right partners, for us to send our kids to meet other kids of similar values, and so on and so forth. And so, my sisters, my brothers, the point is, Muharram is really important. Muharram is really important. But the rest of the year is also really important. That we should invest our time and energy to attend, to help out, to volunteer, to bring our kids. Because if we all have the sense that I am responsible for the outcome of this work. If it succeeds, I succeed. If it fails, I suffer. This community is creating the mind and the identity of my children. Then I need to know, I need to have a say in it. I need to contribute. Rather than rely on somebody else to do that. Rather than rely on somebody else to work hard and come and contribute, when I can just work hard and not contribute. صلوا على محمد وآل محمد.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
And so, this is why, just when you understand this framework, it starts to make a lot of sense why the Prophet ﷺ and Ahlul Bayt spoke so much about creating these communities, invested so much of their time in creating these support networks. People that can interact, people that can talk, people that can add value to each other. You know, one of the key things that we don't talk about often, what Imam Hossein did in the events of Ashura, he did two things. Well, multiple things, but two of them I'm going to talk about. One, he pushed people back to their core identities that the Prophet had built. You know what, I was talking about this identity being something, an inner compass in us. It's something internal, something we don't really notice. But we notice it when we're under real pressure, when we have to make really tough decisions. You notice people at times of war, they rally to their ethnic backgrounds, like, you know, all civil wars. There is some defining thing where people, when they're under so much pressure, they go back to what they know that's so inner in them, so core in them. Something that's so fundamental to them. When times are good, it's less important. People don't care. People can cope, can adapt, can integrate. Put pressure, people go back. People start to just go dig deep into those identities and use those rulers to compare and make decisions, make tough decisions, and that way you differentiate between them. What Imam Hossein did, the Prophet ﷺ and Imam Ali and Imam Hassan spent years building community identity. Then Yazid came with a different way of doing things. Muawiyah before that and Yazid. And so Imam Hossein knew in the core of the community those values are fine. The problem was on the surface. But if he lets it continue, a new environment is created where it becomes legitimate, okay to do that. So he gave them this really challenging question. He pushed the community to its core. And you see the ramifications. How after the martyrdom of Imam Hossein, there was a revolution every few years, sometimes every few months. Like they're just erupting everywhere. Because when he gave people such a even you know the story, right? Even the army that was sent to kill Imam Hossein was split. They were crying themselves. He managed to ask them a question that would push them, that all the layers of payment and wealth and authority and the fear for themselves and their lives, he just gave them this really stark question that they really had to choose. You just can't. You had to choose a side. And it was, what the clever thing is, it doesn't matter which side you chose. If you chose the right side, you win. If you chose the wrong side, you will still know that you did, and you will spend years of your life regretting. Essentially, he managed to just create a situation that was win-win. And while the government was busy dealing with Imam al-Hussein and the consequences and ramifications of Karbala, Imam Zain al-Abidin was creating the identity, the alternative identity. Then Imam al-Baqir, then Imam al-Sadiq. By the time the government realized, they'd already built a whole huge host of society, community of companions, who today we have so much of the knowledge of Islam through them. They were steps ahead, not behind. They didn't react to oppression. They were well ahead of the curve. And they invested so much of their time in communities, in picking companions, in choosing them, in teaching them, in making them learn by association, as well as other things. And this is today, if you pick some of the features, the key features of Islam, you see this concept of community, Sahaba, companions, who accompany the Prophet and learn so much from him because he invested so much in them and used them as a fertile ground to produce the future generations. That's essentially what we're trying to do here. Essentially what we need to learn from and try to replicate. And some of those companions actually appeared on the day of Ashura. So that what the Prophet ﷺ was doing, some of its fruits were on the day of Ashura. And they also added so much value, because when people were looking at the two camps, they could see anybody, or the vast majority of people, those who remained, who remember the Prophet, who had the legitimacy, were actually on the side of Hussein. And that reinforced the message. And so when we think to ourselves, we need to understand the value of associating ourselves with the right people. And often in Karbala, when we talk about Imam Hossein, we talk about his companions. He was the Imam. He was the leader. He was the important one. But they are important too. Ahlul Bayt taught us how to talk about them and taught us to remember them. Imam Zayn al-Abidin, when he buried them, he gave them a grave right next to Imam Hussein and made it very clear and very visible that these people are important. They're important because of their contribution, because they made the right decision when it mattered. And I told you yesterday, when I was talking about Muslim ibn Aqil, how there was a stark choice, how so many people were with Hussein, were arrested, were taken, how some were with Muslim and then started to lose their, when the question was hard, when they were pushed against the wall, when they were given the option to make a decision, they buckled. Some went home. They wanted to save their lives. But some didn't do that. Habib ibn Madahir and Muslim ibn Awsajah were in Kufa. Habib was a companion of the Prophet, attended all the battles of Imam Ali alayhi salam, and was in Kufa. And so Kufa was under siege. There was an army that blocked the way completely. So leaders were in prison. Some people were killed, some were deported, and there was an army blocking the way. You cannot get to Karbala. Impossible to go to Karbala. Thousands of soldiers blocking the way. And they looked for somebody, anybody who looked like he might be heading to battle, they would arrest him. But Habib and his identity and his values and Muslim were so determined that they would try. You see, people try to find ways to escape something like this. They tried to find ways to join Imam Hussein. They could have said, look, we couldn't, it was hard. There was no way for us to go. Muslim walked separately. He went on his own, walking, because usually if you're traveling to Karbala, that distance, about 80 kilometers, you would need a horse. You can't do it walking, typically. And so Muslim was just going on his own. When he reached those guards, those barriers, those soldiers, they saw him. He was just somebody walking. He wasn't heading to battle, clearly. Separately, he had a servant who took his horse. Again, when that servant reached the checkpoint, they said, well, I'm taking this horse to water it. Just take him to the river. I'm just taking the horse to the river to give it some water. And that's okay, because the servant can't use the horse for battle. So both of them looked like they had nothing to do with Imam Hussein. And then Muslim had arranged to meet his servant away when he escaped and his servant escaped. They met at a later point, and he would take the horse and ride to Imam Hussein. Habib went from Kufa to Imam Hussein, and they went through all sorts of hoops to get to Karbala. So you see why Imam Hussein, to them, these were special. They're not just anyone. These are people who beat odds, who were in a very difficult situation, still had the right values and still wanted to come and fight with Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam. And so imagine Imam al-Hussein on the eve of Ashura. Sayyidah Zainab approaches him and says, have you Do you know your companions? Are they reliable? Will they fight with you tomorrow? Have you tested them? Have you made sure that they will fight? And he says, yes, I know them. And some of them got a whiff of the news. And they would come and almost show their strength, show to Sayyidah Zainab that while we're here, we will never let Ahlul Bayt fight. And there was this debate on the eve of Ashura, who would go first. Ahlul Bayt said, it's our cause. Hussein is our son, we'll go first and defend. And the companions said, no, no, no. We will protect you and Ahlul Bayt. When we're gone, you can do what you like. But while we're alive, we'll never let you fight. And they got their way. They insisted they would have to go first before anyone from Ahlul Bayt would go to battle. And so Imam al-Hussein on that eve, they spent the night praying to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. On the day of Ashura, he organized his army. He puts the likes of Zuhair, the likes of Habib. At this time, Al-Hurr was on the other side. Al-Hurr al-Riyahi was somebody who was sent in to control the movement of Imam al-Hussein. Hurr, on the day of Ashura, was standing next to a guy next to him, and he tells him, he sends him away, gives him a signal to go away. And he thought, well, I didn't know what Habib was doing, what Al-Hurr was doing. And Hurr was just holding his horse, and they say he was shaking. He was shaking. Somebody said, if I was to be asked about the bravest man in Kufa, I would say it's you. He was a great commander. He had thousands under him. And he was shaking on the day of Ashura. He tells him, I'm giving myself the choice between heaven and hell. This is the moment where I have to decide whether I want to go to heaven or hell. And I know what is right and what's wrong. And I'll never choose hell. I'm going to go to heaven, whatever it means. And he heads towards the camp of Imam al-Hussein. Comes close to Imam al-Hussein and says, Imam al-Hussein says, who is this? He says, my name is Hur. Do you remember me? I was the guy who brought you here. I was the guy who blocked your army. Imam Hussein says, I remember you. He says, is there time for me for repentance? Can I repent at this point in time? He says, yes. And then Hur repents. Imam Hussein says, come down, come down. He says, I want to go now. While I'm on my horse, I want to be one of the first people on your side to go to battle. Al-Hurr goes to battle. He's now fighting his friends, the people he led for a while. He goes to battle and fights, and then Al-Hurr falls to the ground, and Imam al-Hussein goes to Hurr ibn Yazid. Now Al-Hurr is being held by Imam al-Hussein. Imagine the difference. So Al-Hurr is being held by Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam. And then the others, one after the other, one after the other. There was a newly wedded man, Wahab, with his wife, with his bride and his mother. And his mother would say, go to battle, go to battle. And then he would go to battle, fight, and come back and say, is this enough? She said, it's never enough. It's never enough until you save Hussein or you die. And so he goes to battle, and then his mother and wife both go to battle after him. Although they're not allowed to, they go. Not required to, they go. And then you get the commanders of the army, the likes of Zuhair ibn al-Qayn, the likes of Habib ibn Madahir. These people that the camp relied on the day of Ashura, it was prayer time. Abu Thamama says to Imam al-Hussein, I want to pray this last prayer with you, O Hussein, before I go to battle. He says, form a line here so we can pray. And Zuhair stands there and others stand there. And they are standing there to protect Hussein. One of the arrows escapes the barrier and hits Imam al-Hussein. So this guy just goes and spreads himself wide and stands in front of Hussein so that he becomes a barrier. So that when the arrows come, they would hit him and not Hussein. So Hussein would finish praying. And they kept coming at him. Until Imam al-Hussein finished, he fell to the ground. He looks to Imam al-Hussein and says, have I done enough? I couldn't stand anymore. I'm full of arrows in my body. Have I done enough? And then Imam al-Hussein had to say goodbye to people like these, one after the other. Zuhair ibn al-Qayn goes to battle. He fights them bravely as the great man. Habib goes. And then Imam al-Hussein would see them and would go and say goodbye to them one after the other, until all of them had been killed. Then Imam al-Hussein says, Zuhair, لا زهير لي اليوم. There's no Zuhair in my camp. He's gone now. Habib. And there's no Habib in my camp. All of my companions have gone. All have been killed. And every time that someone would go, he'd go bring him back and bring him back and bring him back. And that's an additional layer of suffering that Ahlul Bayt suffered seeing these great people die. But they stood when it mattered. And they acted when it mattered. So many centuries later, you go today to the Imam Hossein's shrine, you see a separate grave for Habib. And you see the grave of the companions. And every time you recite ziyarah, you dedicate a section to these people. Sisters, brothers, let's pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He may give us the ability, the strength, the clarity to create those environments that we could develop ourselves and our communities, our children, instill the right values and identities in them, so that if they ever had the opportunity to answer the question, with Imam al-Mahdi Ajallah Farajah, they would answer it correctly. So that if they ever had the question on the Day of Judgment, if they were to be put in the position of those on the Day of Ashura, they wouldn't hesitate. They would know where right and wrong is. That's the point of us gathering. The point is that we understand where right is, where wrong is, and we know where we want to be. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us the energy to support our communities, to contribute as much as we can, to keep the momentum going from Muharram throughout the year. وآخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله الطاهرين.